Hello everyone. This is a quick introductory sort of explanation and screencast of RubyTalk, which is my new Ruby development environment. As you'll see, it's heavily, if you've ever interacted with any of the Smalltalk development environments, either Squeak or Pharaoh or any of the newer ones, it has a lot in common. So let's get started. The first thing I'd like to say is that just like any other Ruby project you'd encounter, it has a gem file. In the future, I would like to incorporate the gem file into the world, as you'll see in a minute, but for now it remains as a file sort of outside the scope of the actual RubyTalk environment. It may turn out to be that that's the better way to go, and so I still use bundle install just like you'd expect here, just like any other Ruby project. The other thing I'd like to note is that you see a bunch of JSON files here. For example, class methods.json, classes, methods, requires, etc. This is actually how the Ruby code is stored that is written and developed from within the environment. And the other Ruby files you see here, some of them are old and I need to remove them, but for example, world.rb file is very short. All it does is basically launch RubyTalk, which require init is what that does. So anyway, we'll launch the environment right now and I'll show you what's what. So what it's done here is basically defined, it's basically reading the JSON files and redefining everything that's been defined in the prior development environment. So I have a doc here. Don't worry about why that's separate. Basically, I'm treating the doc as something you can add different buttons to behave as shortcuts to other widgets that you create. So I've created 3. The first one's called workspace, which is, I'll click that now. And a workspace is, if you're familiar with a REPL or an interactive shell or a console, this is basically what a workspace is, except that it's not line by line. So you'll see here I can do 5 plus 6. When I say do it, it'll print the result, which is 11. It's just evaluating. So if I say class Dave, I can say end, and I can say d equals Dave.new. And I can say d.inspect, and you'll see that it prints out the result right there. So this is a workspace. I use them quite a bit. In the actual Smalltalk environments, they actually have a different one for doing things versus printing them, although here it's just print. And so I said before that the point of this environment is to stop interacting with files and to directly interact with either the definitions or instances of your objects and the classes and so on. And so the way you do this, both in Smalltalk and now in RubyTalk, is through what's called the system browser. So you'll see here, basically on the left, you have all the different modules and classes that have been defined in the environment. Most of them are just standard Ruby classes. Also included here are any external gems from the gem file that I have required, or that were required during the bootstrapping of the environment. So for example, you can see HTTP party here. And you'll note that when I click on most of these right now, nothing really happens. You can maybe shortcut to viewing the docs, which is just a shortcut to Googling it. However, when you choose a class that's been created from within RubyTalk, things look a little bit different. So I think as an example, I'll use the workspace. So this workspace was created from the environment. I created this workspace without building anything into a file. And so the way I'm going to do that here is I'll search for workspace. And you can see that when I click the workspace class, I can see its instance methods and its class methods. This particular one doesn't have any class methods, but that's where they'd be. And so just like every good class, we have a constructor called initialize. When I click on initialize, this is the code for the initialize method, basically. The syntax is ever so slightly different. It's the block syntax rather than using the def keyword and having a parameter list. But you could put the parameter list right in between the pipes, just like a regular Ruby block. And if I make any changes here or anything, what happens is I click accept, and they'll be applied to this class definition right in memory. And actually what happens right now, I'll improve this in the future hopefully, but what happens right now is that they're immediately saved to JSON. So if the thing crashes, you still have your most recent changes. So there's no save button anywhere. There's an accept button that just applies your changes. Okay, so let's show you that this really works. You can see here that, by the way, I'm using the TK Ruby bindings, the TK windowing sort of GUI toolkit from Tickle and ActiveState. So if I want to change lowercase to uppercase right there, and I click accept, I'm going to move this workspace over here and make a new workspace, and you'll see that the title has been changed. The new one has a lowercase w rather than an uppercase w. I've changed this definition, which means any new instances of workspace that I create will use this as their class, but the old one is still around. It's an instance of a definition that is no longer around, which is interesting, and not something you're used to interacting with most of the time in a regular Ruby application today. So this is just to show you that the changes I'm making are live. They happen immediately, and I don't have to save a file and flip back and forth, anything like that. So I'm going to move this back. And I'm going to show you an instance of a very simple application we can make with this system. Obviously, this is still very, very alpha, very beta prototype. I would not recommend many people use this for anything serious. It could crash at any time. There's a bunch of multi-threading issues. I'll show you the roadmap in a second, but it's usable now. I'm building it in itself, which is a pretty cool thing to do. So let's see. I think maybe a good place to start for a sample application would be creating a new class. So one thing I need to do is call create class, and I'm going to call it, we'll make a new RubyTalk timer. I want to inherit from object. The only reason I need to use this create class function is so that it records it in JSON. That's really the only reason. Otherwise I could just declare class like it is here. Again, that's a small sort of hack that I have to use. But okay, so that's done. I don't yet have a way to reload this and make it live, so I'm going to have to make a new one. Again, lots to do, lots to do. But if I type RubyTalk timer here, I'm going to say I want a constructor. And I'm going to, in this constructor, say, okay, well, I want a root. Actually, for now, we'll leave it empty to keep it simple. So when I make a new one, what I'd like to do is, in a separate thread, I can't remember if this is the right way to do threads, but we'll figure it out in a second. While true, do. One of the many things I'd like to implement here is syntax highlighting and all the normal sort of editing that you'd expect. But first thing I'm going to do is say terminal. By the way, terminal notifier is an excellent gem that I'm using to do notification center notifications in OS 10. I'm going to set to notify. Here I am. I'm going to call sleep for 5 seconds. I'm going to click accept. So what I'm going to do here now, I have a thread list. This basically is just asking Ruby what are all my threads. And in a new workspace, I'm going to make a new RubyTalk timer. Oh, and there's an error. That wasn't supposed to happen. See what's happened there? That lowercase t right there. So I'm going to do that, fix my error, and click go. And nothing's happening. I'm going to look up Ruby thread. Actually doing this elsewhere, and I just can't remember the syntax here. I think I have to call .start. Yeah, got it. So instead I'm going to assign this to a... so you can see I'm not editing files here. I'm literally just going back and forth. This is what it's like to develop an application. I got my thread list. Let's see if I have that workspace still. So I'm going to say RubyTalk timer.new. Do it. No such thing as start. Don't actually know what I'm doing wrong. Well, .new. what's happening here, I know what's happening. What's happening is because this is happening in a separate thread, I'm not getting all the correct dialogues when exceptions occur. So there's an unhandled exception happening because I had a capital T for true instead of lowercase, because I'm mixing up my Ruby and my Python. So I'm going to keep this in the foreground and say RubyTalk timer.new. And there we go. You can see these notifications. It's going to sleep for 5 seconds. I'll create a new one. Also, you can see here that this third thread has now been added. Oh, there's another notification. You can see that there. So what you can imagine is inside of this will keep going until I kill it. If I wanted to say, you know, if I had a, for example, Craigslist, there's a popular if this and then that trigger that many people use to sort of repeatedly search Craigslist for a given query. If I wanted to say Craigslist dot retrieve and curate to figure out which ones are new, which ones are old, and I wanted to do this every 5 minutes, or so many minutes every minute, every 60 seconds, and click accept, it would go and it would give me my results here. So this is a very brief overview of the kind of programming that you do with RubyTalk. Perhaps I can come up with a better application later, but I just wanted to give a sort of a brief overview. I don't think I'm missing anything. So, oh, one other thing I would like to mention actually is these notifications are going to keep going, but the system browser class itself was written in RubyTalk. I used the workspace in order to build the system browser. So the system browser has some class methods, for example, open with selection. I can call system browser to open with selection workspace, perhaps, and it would automatically open with workspace selected. You can see that. You can see the initialize method. I'm making module lists. It was interesting developing this because I was sort of freed up from having the cognitive overhead of thinking about files on a file system. So you'll see that module list is a thing called module list is a class, and I'm interacting with it in many different module list.onSelect, and I'm passing it a proc or a lambda here. You can see that the notebook is a TK element that lets me do tabs, which is what this thing is right here, classes versus instances, etc. And this is not very much code. There's some code here, some code here. These are selecting methods, and go back to module list, for example. This here is a module list. The search bar is part of the module list component, and so what I've done is I've assembled this system browser widget from sort of smaller widgets that I've also created. So module list is an example of that. So when I construct one, this is what the constructor looks like. Anyway, it's just an example of the fact that I built this inside itself, which is kind of a mind-bending thing for a lot of people. One thing I've made here is a HipChat class, sort of playing around during the construction. Hopefully, hopefully I will have gotten rid of this token by the time you watch this, but we use HipChat here at Block, and so this lets me type something like, for example, I can say my HipChat dot new dot notify room, because that's the function right there. Hello world. When I do this, it has successfully sent the notification. So anyway, I don't want to ramble on too much, but this is a brief overview of what it's like to work inside of the RubyTalk environment. Hope to have some better examples of bigger, larger, more complex applications that you can build. But I would like to say that I've started to use this for a lot of my personal projects, and I like it a lot better than for example using a text editor and for example server. The next big project is going to be a web application framework, so something like Rails, except perhaps simpler, not so much obviously based on the file system, but I'm going to try to pull active record in to RubyTalk. I should be able to use that. And then if you want to learn more about RubyTalk, it's open source. I haven't decided on the license yet, but if you go here, github.com, dpl2 RubyTalk, I've got my roadmap on here. For example, one thing I'd like to do is persistent data. So for example, right now, persistent data and the object memory. Right now when I close the RubyTalk environment, all the instances of classes that I've created are gone. although their definitions remain. That's something that's very different than the way Smalltalk works. In Smalltalk, you sort of do a memory dump of all the objects in memory. That's something that, in my opinion, is a little bit too different from the way most programmers work now to ever be adopted. But that's why I use JSON instead. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. But yeah, this is RubyTalk. So thanks for watching.